Hello, everybody, and I hope you can see me well and see the slides, but I'm sorry that I can't see you. I'm going to talk today about the Leeds Zoological and Botanical Gardens and the Royal Park. The gardens were described at their time as the most beautiful public gardens in England. It was a short-lived project, but full of high ambitions. The story goes back to the 1830s, when there was a great deal of concern nationally about public health, the health of people living in the great industrial cities. The cholera epidemic in 1832 had highlighted the problems of people living in the cities. 700 people had died in Leeds alone. And a select committee was set up to consider the provision of open space and public walks for people in the cities. And Leeds came in for rather shameful special mention by the committee because of their very high death rate. 6,000 out of 10,000 people in Leeds died before they were 21. So there was a strong motive here to consider setting up some sort of gardens, some sort of public gardens that people could go to for exercise and fresh air. And alongside that, there was growing interest in zoology, in botany, in rare plants, in horticulture. And these helped to motivate many cities to establish gardens. Liverpool, Manchester, and in 1836, Sheffield, quite close to home for Leeds. And there was a sense that Leeds was falling behind and really needed to take action. This picture shows Leeds in 1840. And you'll see the conditions that people lived in, not just the working classes in the cramped courts off Kirkgate and in the centre of town, but also the people who serviced the economy. And they were living in the town too, and they needed to have access to gardens and fresh air. And the person who was really responsible for promoting this idea and pushing it along for Leeds, very conscious of the civic rivalry theme, was Edwin Edinson. He was a young solicitor, and in 1836, when the council was reformed, he was appointed the town clerk. He was only 31. He was, I think, the youngest town clerk anywhere in the country at that time. And he was very much an organising force behind the gardens. So he was moving things on, and it's obvious that in that period, in 1836, was just established as the town clerk, he was going around talking to people. He went to Sheffield and visited the gardens there that had opened, rather magnificent gardens, and he devised a scheme whereby this money could be brought together, private money. There was no chance of the ratepayers supporting this, so it had to be a privately funded scheme. And he must have worked behind the scenes to talk to people, get a scheme together, a bit similar to the one in Sheffield. And by May 1837, it was possible to organise a public meeting. And here's the notice of the public meeting on the 22nd of May, 1837. It was very much covered by the newspapers, who reported on how well attended it was and with their highly respectable audience. And here you'll see the terms of the proposal that was being put forward. An institution which would afford the inhabitants of this populous district a means of recreation, so recreation was part of it, interesting and instructive. There was an educational element to it too. But at the same time, the public health idea was still there in the background. To accomplish this object, it proposed to raise £20,000. This was a very ambitious objective here, but it was going to be offered in shares of £10 each, which it was thought was quite affordable, not obviously affordable to the working classes labouring in the mills, but affordable to all those new middle class groups of shopkeepers, solicitors themselves, other kinds of people who serviced the economy. There was no great aristocratic entry or patronage for this scheme, as in fact there was in Sheffield. But you'll see that there's an extra bit to the proposal. 2,000 of the 20,000 would be a reserve fund, and £1,000 would be for draining and improving Woodhouse Moor. And you'll see that's in order that the inhabitants of all classes may have the advantage of an agreeable and healthful promenade. So this picks up on the idea of the public walks. The meeting was fairly successful. It was very well attended, and people subscribed up to about half what was required. So not the 20,000, but just over, in fact, 11,000 was subscribed in the terms of these shares. The flax baron John Marshall was one of the principal investors with his sons. There were several of his sons who were involved as well, but each of them only bought 20 shares, £200 worth. So they weren't really they weren't dipping deep into their pockets for this scheme. He, in fact, had been one of the people who gave evidence to that select committee about public walks, talking about the conditions of the working classes in Leeds and the very terrible poverty that they lived in. And he took a role here. He was later appointed president of the society that organised the gardens, the plans for the gardens. But what you see when you look at the share book, which still exists, showing all the shares that were bought in this project, you can see that nobody really went very far in spending a lot of money. And further down the social scale, there were lots of people just buying 1 share or 3 shares or 5 shares, not able to afford very much more than that. So really from the beginning, the scheme lacked a really big investment. So it was chronically underfunded in terms of the ambitions that they had for the gardens. Enough, however, was collected. They got set a minimum of 7,500, and it was about 11,000. So enough was collected to think about buying the land. Where would it be? There were several possibilities, but the one that was chosen in the end was in Headingley. And now I'm just going to see if I can get a pointer to show you where we are on this. So here we are. This is the land. The colouring is actually very faint, but there is a pink colouring to it here on this. This is a hand-drawn map that's taken from the original map. There's Headingley itself. There's St Michael's Church. Here's the road coming down from the centre of town. There was access to this land via this very narrow old lane, Chapel Lane, which was originally the old lane that led up from Burley up to the chapel at Headingley. That's why it's called Chapel Lane. So these 4 fields, they were just fields in the middle of other fields, were the ones that were chosen for the site of these gardens. They had to buy the forecloses, 4,300, as it says at the top there. It was very suitable because it was away from the direction of the smoke from Leeds. You saw from that first slide what the great pollution the smoke was causing. Here it was away from the prevailing winds that brought the smoke over. It was down in a valley. There were water courses, and there were springs, and there were some mature trees. So it represented a very suitable site. It's also quite close to some of the people who'd invested in the project, so that was an extra advantage. Chapel Lane itself wouldn't have been much good for access from town, so from the main road, the Turnpike Road, which went on to Otley from Leeds, they had to buy the land as well that led down here to provide an access road to the gardens. So that's what that is. So that was extra land that they had to buy and pay for. And it had to go on, in fact, just past the entrance to the gardens to allow access to these land down here of Tatham, the flax spinner, who was going to develop that land later on. But at the moment, it remains just in fields. There's a little corner here, which we'll hear a little more about later. So they bought the land. They advertised a competition for the design. And this is the resulting winning entry. 17 entries, so there was quite an interest in the design project. And this one by William Billington, an engineer, and Edward Davis, who was a botanist, they were both from Wakefield, was extremely elaborate and ambitious. This is the main entrance. Here's that road, Spring Road it is now, coming down from the turnpike to the entrance here, and then in through greenhouses into these lovely gardens with the winding walks, parterre. There were going to be an orangery, a museum, an arboretum, animal enclosures, invisible and movable animal enclosures. So a very ambitious project, beautifully drawn. This doesn't give you much idea because it's so small scale. It was a huge scale that it was on. Here's just a detail of it here for that principal entrance. You'll see these panelled walls, which we'll just see something of later as well. Okay, so the land was bought and work could begin on preparing the land. But then they had the idea that it would be a zoological garden. And so somebody had to go about animals, thinking about the animals. So Thomas Prigentile, who was the surgeon at the infirmary, a very distinguished man, was one of the investors in the scheme, and there were other doctors who were investors on the health front. And he was appointed the curator for zoology. And there's an interesting letter which survives from George Wombwell of Wombwell's Menagerie, responding to Prigentile's inquiry about what animals would £1,000 buy. And the answer really from George Wombwell is not very much. He could provide some lions and tigers, as he provided for the Manchester Zoo, but it was not enough at all for elephants, so no elephants would be possible. And of course, they had to remember that any animals that they had would need looking after, feeding. You'd have to have keepers to look after them. It all obviously became a step too far for the organisers. This committee of men, all with other dogs and other concerns to think about, that side of the gardens was pushed aside at that point, and the focus became botanical. It took 2 years for the gardens to be constructed, ready. It's a reminder, there are reports in the papers of the way the work was ongoing. This is a later map, but it shows you then how things had progressed. the access road was built. All the way round the gardens, a very high stone wall was constructed. The fountain was put in place. The lakes were dug out. This was a huge task, digging out the lakes, and then they were stocked with fish. So 2 lakes, and you can see here the winding paths. But the other aspects of that very ambitious scheme, the great glass houses, the museum, and so on, those had to be left aside. There wasn't money for very much building. The only building that went on really were these little buildings here, which was the Porter's Lodge and a small greenhouse there, and a lodge right down there at the Burley end of the gardens. That's quite an important point, because that was also an entrance to the gardens down there. And that's where the supervisor of the gardens lived. And these winding paths had to be gravelled. You can imagine how long all this work took. The botanist, Edward Davies, who'd been part of the planning, had done the design for the garden, he was involved for the first couple of years in actually setting out and laying out the gardens, the practical work of it. But in the last year, they brought in another man from Woburn, the Duke of Bedford's gardener, to help with the layout of the gardens. And I think there's no doubt that these gardens were very splendid. The reports on them all stress how lovely they were. So by July 1840, everything was ready and the gardens could be opened. And here's the advertisement that they were going to be opened, not only to the shareholders, but to the public on Wednesday, the 8th of July. Quite expensive. Admission 6pence, and children and servants 3pence each. If you think that the average income of a mill hand here was between 6 shillings to 10 shillings a week, you can see that this was well beyond scope for most working people in the mills and so on. One of the aspects that had already been agreed between the committee who were organising the gardens was that they would not be open on Sunday. That really also excluded all the working people from coming even as a treat. So no Sunday. This is Sunday observance. It was very strongly felt by the organising committee, though there had been arguments about it. And the other aspect, just to note, is that there was never any alcohol on sale in the gardens. There was no wish for these gardens to become any sort of, well, not strictly, carefully administered. And standards of behaviour had to be very correct. So beautiful gardens, but where are the wild animals, is what the newspapers had to say. The Sheffield Gardens did have a bear and a bear pit. So there was a feeling that something was lacking. There was a fox, there was an eagle, there were some swans, there were 3 tortoises carefully listed, but not really very much at all to represent the zoological title of the gardens. But in 1841, a year after opening, some more money was gained by a new share offer, and some improvements could take place. And one of those improvements, which will be familiar to some of you, was a very fine bear pit. And one of the newspapers says it was ready for to be a well-bred and decently behaved bear that came into these gardens. So this is what it looked like. The actual pit for the bear is behind here. These towers were for people, particularly children, to climb up. There's a staircase inside, and then they could throw buns, down to the bare food, down to the bare pine in the pit. And so that was a very magnificent addition. It was particularly attractive to children. And it stood on the edge of that lake, the first lake in the gardens. But still, this problem of Sunday opening was under discussion, and there was a lot of feeling, including in the newspapers, that it was ridiculous that there should be this restriction on people coming on a Sunday, which was their day off, their day for going anywhere. That includes the middle class. It's people who were running shops and so on in town. They wanted to be able to come on a Sunday. And so finally, in August 1841, this ban was relaxed a little bit. It caused a tremendous outpouring of opposition and outrage, and the editor of the Leeds Mercury, Edwin Edinson, resigned from the committee on the basis of this. But as you see, it's quite a limited opening still. It's from 4 o'clock until sunset, tickets still 6p each, and they had to be bought in advance. So there was there were no concessions on price, and people couldn't do it at the last minute. It had to be thought out in advance. However, it did happen, and so people were able to come on a Sunday. And in the autumn 1841, there were some new attractions planned. At this stage, the entertainment aspect of the garden became more important. And so we see that there are some wonderful fireworks, and there's a lot of stress on not just any old fireworks, but fireworks that are part of set pieces. So here you'll see an advertisement for the gardens, for the fireworks, and they're very grand exhibitions. Rare productions will be produced. The Temple of Peace as exhibited before Her Majesty the Queen, grand Napoleonic piece, Weeping Willow drooping over the tomb of the departed emperor, etc., etc. And military music figured a great deal as well. But a shilling each for this sort of special exhibition. And by 1842, another exciting attraction, Signora, sometimes she's Madame Bossini, whose fame for intrepidity and grace is well known. She would climb on the tightrope in a blaze of fireworks. I can never resist reading a bit of the poem that was written, and it appeared on the front page of the Leeds Times, about Signora Rossini at the gardens. The night it was fine and the sky it was clear, when Signora Rossini, unconscious of fear, with step slow and steady and foot firm and true, her path on the rope does she safely pursue. High and still higher she bravely ascends, cheered on by the rapture and shouts of her friends. But hark to that burst of surprise and delight, for proudly she stands on the pinnacle's height. A moment she pauses and silently stands, then waves to the multitudes her snowy white hands. And now she returns, clothed in splendid attire. Then she kneels on the rope, all enveloped in fire. So this was a very spectacular act, and Signora Rossini became a great favourite in Leeds. This poem is written by a shopkeeper, a tailor, who made clothes for the rather handsome audience for Signora Rossini, and that's the point of the poem there. But it shows how well known at that point she became, and she comes back year after year to the gardens, right into old age, in fact, until she has an accident for Signora Rossini. Now, one of the events that became extremely popular at the gardens. One of the few events, really, because when you think of having to keep the gardens open all year round, employ gardeners, keep the gardens in good condition, you needed a lot of people paying money to keep that going. But they did have one particular successful regular event, and that was the annual Whitsuntide Temperance Galas. They were very successful. In the first years, it was from 1841, just 2 years after a year after the gardens had opened, that they began to hold the galas, the Temperance Society, which was a very powerful society, working very throughout Leeds. And these galas were very successful. 19,000 came in 1841. It mounts up to, according to the newspaper reports, about 30,000 coming at much later dates. So here you'll see that there's a grand procession with banners and music that come through the town to the gardens. And there's a great marquee with tea, and there are all sorts of spiced buns and treacle cakes and things being advertised for the tea. And a balloon will ascend filled with temperance tracts. So there's a great event with games, music, and temperance events, temperance addresses going on by the speakers. So here, this particular event is something that was very successful at the gardens, but day by day, it was very difficult to keep the gardens going. At one point, Dr. Baker, who was the surgeon, the town surgeon, and concerned with the poor, he had a recommendation that they should be opened. I'll read you what he said. "We have an excellent botanical garden in Leeds, failing for want of subscribers, whose use is limited to those who can afford to pay for admission. Is there any reason why this should not also be appropriated once a week gratuitously to the use of the poor, and that an annual subscription from the borough rates should enable the proprietors to afford this gratification to the labouring classes?" That was what he had to say in his report in 1842, but it fell on deaf ears as far as the council and the ratepayers were concerned. It was not taken up. And so the fragile financial basis for the garden was really crumbling. And this led in 1848, just 8 years after they'd opened, to the closure of the gardens. Partly, I think, mainly it was a financial problem, but I think also looking at the committee who were running the gardens, they all had other roles. They had other jobs. Edwin Edinson as town clerk, John Marshall and his sons running the great flax factories. They all had other concerns, and perhaps nobody had the enthusiasm that might have carried this forward and perhaps raise more money for it. So here we see the notice of the auction, and it tells you that they were laid out. It tells you about the well-built wall, this great stone wall all the way around. The trees, shrubs and plants are fine. The walks are in good condition, the water and so on, the ponds. But here you see it was already defeatist. The property is in every respect suitable for building sites and will be sold as a sacrifice. So it was sold, it was auctioned, but the purchaser, there was an initial purchaser of the original treasurer, by the original treasurer of the scheme, but then I don't know, are you seeing this thing at the top? I'm trying to get rid of it, but I can't. Henry Cooper Marshall, the fourth son of John Marshall, Mayor of Leeds in 1842, and chairman of the Leeds Thirsk Railway. He was the man who bought the gardens, bought them for just over £6,000 at a loss from the original expenditure. But it's very significant that he was the chairman of the railway, because he will have seen that there was another possibility of life for the gardens, a second life. This is the Ordnance Survey, the second edition's Ordnance Survey of 1851, showing the gardens. You'll see there are still fields, mostly round about it, but down here at the bottom, at the Burley end, is the railway. There's no doubt, I think, that Henry Cooper Marshall, whether he actually influenced the choice of the route, how far he was powerful in doing that, but the fact that it came past here meant that there could be a new existence for these gardens from the train, by access by train, because that meant that people could come from other areas, from other towns, and get to the gardens. But he needed somebody to run it. He obviously wasn't going to run it himself. And he looked for someone to take over the gardens. And here we have Thomas Clapham. This is where he enters the scene. He is a railway excursion agent at this point. The railways had arrived in Leeds in the 1840s, and they brought with them all these new jobs. So there was a pioneering sort of job that wasn't in existence before, for people to take on organising excursions. The different railway companies were all in competition. So this is the advertisement of Thomas Clapham's. He was down in Wellington Street near the railway. And here he's advertising a trip to London and then a trip to Whitby Regatta. I found it very difficult initially to know anything about Thomas Clapham's background. Obviously, this was a new job he was taking on, but I thought he might have had experience with entertainment. But it turned out, quite recently, I found that he was, in fact, just a clog maker and shoemaker in Kirkgate prior to moving into this new area of work of organising railway trips. And we don't have a photo of him, but he was obviously quite a fellow, tall and lanky, tight check trousers, red hair, these descriptions we have of him, and an entrepreneur at heart. And it was he who took over the gardens. He'd had a lease, he took a lease from Henry Marshall, and he changed the name to the Royal Gardens. So the Zoological and Botanical Gardens, that name finishes, but the gardens are still there as now the Royal Gardens. I don't know if you can see this. I'm afraid this is slightly covered over here on my screen, but this is the main entrance here on this side. Do you come in through there? There's the fountain, and here are these lovely winding walks, gravel walks. That little thing there is the bear pit, the two towers and the pit behind on the edge of the lake, the island and the bridges, the parterre, the second lake here. And right up here at the Burley end of the gardens, where the lodge, there's a lodge house, there is the train there, bringing people from town or from Harrogate or from all over that area, bringing them by train to the gardens. This is the letterhead that Thomas Clapham used, had engraved specially, and it's really the only proper view we get of the gardens. There are many descriptions of them, and it's interesting that because of the stone wall that surrounds it, people approaching the gardens didn't really have any idea of what they were going to see as they came through the main entrance. And it was described as a place of enchantment, a secret garden, an enchanting beautifully lit. One of Tommy Clapham's pleasures really is lighting the gardens, to be a fairy paradise, one of the papers describes it as. Here's his publicity for the gardens, using that bird's eye view again, talking about the train and the ways, the omnibuses that are still coming. From 1838, there was a bus coming down the Turnpike Road that would bring people to the gardens. You'll see that it's a much more upfront sort of publicity here, and other days, 4p, it's a lower price, and on Sundays from 1 o'clock, 2p now. So a much more relaxed approach and cheaper for people. Still no alcohol, however. He organises lots of new events. There had been balloon ascents before, but now he has them, many of them in the programme for the gardens. Here's one of the advertisements for the Royal Gardens. This is 1855. And you see that he's linked it. He's linked his balloon ascent to the fall of Sebastopol. And a young lady will ascend in the balloon Victory. And at the same time, there's the bands. Dissolving views are the sort of diorama where lantern slides are projected and then dissolve, melt into another view. And dancing, lots of dancing. So he's very good at linking things up to current events. He also brings special people here, 1855, 56 and 57, concerts by the famous Monsieur Louis Julien and his orchestra. They'd been to America. He was a famous impresario of music. He had a number of different orchestras and bands, very attractive, very popular, a wonderfully spectacular figure, French in origin. His baton is encrusted with diamante, so he's quite an extrovert performer, but with very excellent musicians, and these attract many more people to the gardens. Here's another of these advertisements, again fireworks figure, a fire balloon, and Madame Rossini again, and so on. So these activities are going on. And in this one, in 56, especially for thinking of the Crimean War and Lord Cardigan's charge of the Light Brigade, he's here got permission to bring Lord Cardigan's horse, Ronald, to be exhibited in the gardens. So you'll see that he's talking here about the Battle of Balaclava and this valuable charger which thousands of pounds could not purchase. Again, there are balloon ascents on this particular occasion and an aerostatic giant. So lots of new ideas. I think I've just got a picture of Ronald here. There he is, the famous Ronald. How he managed to organise that, I don't, but he did. And in 1857, he was bringing up a great group from Astley's Amphitheatre in London. There were a lot of London event performances and performers coming to Leeds. I like the idea of this one. There was a procession of 50 knights in full armour on horseback who rode through the principal streets of Leeds to get to the gardens. So a lot was going on in the gardens, a lot of spectacle and entertainment. But at the same time, he was the lessee. Tommy Cook was the lessee of Marshall, of Henry Marshall, and therefore there were restrictions on what he could do, particularly as far as the sale of alcohol is concerned. And it does seem that in this same period of 1857, Tommy was busy buying land for himself next to Woodhouse Moor at Hyde Park, near Hyde Park, buying land to set up his own gardens, where he would have complete control over what went on there. So that period, 57, 58, is a critical period for his involvement with the Royal Gardens, the old Zoological and Botanical Gardens in Headingley, and a new involvement down at Hyde Park. And he's a difficult figure. He's often being attacked for some of these entertainments he provides. He was prosecuted for selling ginger beer at the Royal Gardens because it was stated it was a fermented liquor, but in fact the magistrates dismissed that one. But then he was getting himself in more and more financial difficulty. So he was declared bankrupt in 1857, though he later managed to pay off his debts. Movable goods at the garden were seized and auctioned. A large round Russian brown bear, which he had bought when he first took over the lease, because obviously the first bear had gone when the gardens were sold. This was the bear that he'd acquired, so seized and auctioned. Monkeys, parrots, the pony and gig, even the lawnmowers were seized. I've tried to find out what happened, whether that auction actually took place or whether he managed to pay off his debtors in time to stop the auction. None of this can I find an answer to, so I don't know what happened. It may be that he managed to prevent that auction taking place. I don't know. He gave up the lease in June 1858. So after this bankruptcy problem, he gave up the lease, and those gardens, the Royal Gardens, the original Zoological and Botanical Gardens, were closed. And he himself opened up the Royal Park, his own park and gardens, in May 1858. There was a period where the two were running simultaneously, but it was very brief. And then he switched his attention totally to the Royal Park. The gardens at Headingley were still occasionally open. They were, of course, back now with Henry Marshall, the owner, who had to decide what he was going to do with them. And there's a couple of years where they're obviously planning how to deal with them and how to develop the gardens. And occasionally they are used, particularly for the Temperance Society, again for their temperance galas, but only up till 1859. And then they are closed completely and the area is developed. And we'll come back to that afterwards. But just let's look briefly at Clapham's Royal Park, because that's one of the special places of Leeds that has disappeared completely. So here's Woodhouse Moor. Okay. Here's the road from Leeds. Here's Hyde Park Road, and there is Clapham's Royal Park, relatively small, though in fact Thomas Clapham owned some of the land around, quite a lot of the land around. This was originally the Victoria cricket ground here. So this was what he bought, and this was now his own project, and he was in control of it. He advertises it and he makes sure that people know it's not the property formerly known as the Leeds Botanical Gardens. That's been closed. And this is all Thomas Clapham's own management. He's going to supply the great want of innocent amusement and recreation for all the inhabitants of Leeds. Only 7 acres, but he had bought a lot of extra land. So his plan was to expand it nearer to the centre of Leeds for walking, of course, near the romantic village of Headingley, as he says, omnibuses, picnic parks, picnic parties catered for. But as you see here, wine, ale and porter available as well. So alcohol too. It's on the east side of Woodhouse Moor, as he said. 40 acres of Woodhouse Moor, still not developed, the moor at this point. It was bought by the council in 1857, and work did start then on draining it and improving it and building paths over it. But at this point, it wasn't like that. A magnificent view of the country, thickly studded with the beautiful residences of the merchant princes and aristocracy. This picture by Thomas Sutcliffe, probably from the 1860s, show what we think is the entrance to the Royal Park. This is Woodhouse Moor, still pretty rough ground. And here, this house is where the entrance was. This is what is now Brudenell Road. And that was the Royal Park behind. That's what we believe that this picture shows. This was an internal picture of the park, given a lot of praise. Again, lots of entertainments going on here. But he did also lay on music, as he said, for the middle and upper classes on a Wednesday. But the rest of the time, it was devoted to balloon ascents, fireworks, dancing on the biggest dancing platform in the country, according to his publicity, Punch and Judy, performing dogs, circus-type tricks and performances. It won a lot of criticism, the Royal Park, and Tommy Clapham was in conflict with the magistrates over it and with the neighbours, who didn't like the noise, didn't like the dancing, didn't like what was going on there, particularly pigeon shooting. And the particular thing that he got into trouble with in 1868 with the magistrates was over music on Sunday. That had always been allowed previously until the 1866 Improvement Act for Leeds, and then it was cracked down on. And you'll see here he's taking a very belligerent attitude towards the magistrates, believing this decision to be arbitrary and a great injustice to the inhabitants. It was only ever sacred music that he had played. I shall continue to have music performed every Sunday during July until further notice. So he's challenging the authorities at this point. Incidentally, he became a Leeds councillor and was a popular figure among the working people because he seemed to be on their side for providing entertainment and including this music on a Sunday. But in fact, he got into increasing trouble. He was constantly fined, higher and higher fines. And in the end, in 1871, he gave up the park and it was sold. This is the sale plan. Here it is. And this was the land that he had to sell. It was taken over for a while as a going concern by the Leeds Horticultural Gardens Company, who had Blondin, the hero of Niagara, come and do some of his wonderful feats, like balancing the chair and cooking the omelette. But it finally closed in 1888. By this time, public parks, Roundtable Park had been acquired, Woodhouse Moor had been drained, so there were other options for people that were free. He still retained some land next to the park, and he was again prosecuted for allowing betting on games of Nur and Spell on the land. He said he went about telling people they mustn't bet, but the magistrates took no notice of him. And again, he was fined. He finished up bankrupt. He moved off, just to finish his story, he moved off to London to these ailing Surrey gardens, so the same sort of work, but they were already coming to the end of their life. And in the end, they closed. He moved first to Scarborough, then to Hull with his third wife, and he died in 1895 after further bankruptcy sieges. There was a feeling, even among members, very respected members of the Thoresby Society, like William Wheater and Frank Kidson, that prosecution of Tommy Clapham had turned into persecution, and puritanical views had really been responsible for him losing out in the end. Very quickly, the Royal Park was buried under new housing. So that's where it was. And you see very quickly, within a few years, it was built over. There is a house that's on the edge of there in Hyde Park Road, which has this sort of restaurant in, which does appear to be what was left of Tommy's house. He did move to live there, and the entrance for the turnstiles into the Royal Park. Otherwise, it's just place names that remember it, it's obliterated. But that's not quite true of the old Zoological and Botanical Gardens. So if we look here at the 1888 Ordnance Survey Map, during the 1860s, this new road, Cardigan Road, named after Lord Cardigan, of course, was constructed right through the gardens. That's the bear pit that you can see on the side there. It's now on the side of the road instead of the lake. And these big plots were drawn up to take big housing, big villa housing. And you can see that some of them at this stage had been built, others were still waiting to be occupied. Victoria Road, which in fact at one point a new entrance to the park had been created there, that's now cut through and joins Cardigan Road. It was a slow development, but that's what happened there. Much of the wall remained in place. And of course the bear pit remained. And at first, by the 1890s, 1900s, it had fallen into complete disrepair. So that's what it looked like then. That's the pit behind. It gives you a view now of the pit behind it. But as you see, it was in terrible condition. Trees growing up out of the brickwork and in a very dangerous state. It was then restored, taken over by the Civic Trust and restored. It's been listed as of historic interest. It's perhaps the finest surviving bear pit in the country. But again now, in fact, it is in need of further work, and the Civic Trust have the problem really of dealing with that structure. So much a souvenir of that past history of the gardens. You can still see the wall, and here in this little bit by what was the original entrance, you see still the panels. I'll show you what they looked like here on the plan, rather less elaborate, but panels still there, and the wall itself curving along right down to Burghley Park Station. Up through in places, of course, but it still goes down, and to some extent exists on the other side too. The fountain, the base of the fountain is there in the garden of Cardigan House. The little corner of the field called Potter's Close remained a wild little piece of land for a long time, but then was taken over. Sparrow Park, it's been called. It's still accessible. You can go in and sit in it, though it's now looking rather neglected. And you can drive down Cardigan Road and just get a little bit of the feel of the old gardens from the trees and the gardens on each side. Next time you do it, next time you drive down there, I recommend remembering the fairy enchantment of the original gardens. I'm finished now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eve, for that most enjoyable and informative talk. We've had one question on the chat function from Jane Collins. Excellent talk. I've learned such a lot about the area. But her question is, did the problems of the Royal Park have any influence when it came to developing Roundhay Park?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. Possibly. I don't think Roundhay Park was ever seen, was it, as so much of a venue for entertainment. So there weren't those sorts of problems, I think, envisaged. It was much more seen as a place for fresh air, exercise, walking, and so on. But it's possible, because there was certainly resistance from local inhabitants, local residents at Roundhay, some resistance to the idea of opening it as a public park. And it may well be that some of those problems that were seen at the Royal Park were there in people's minds. It's an interesting question.
Brian Sanderson wants to ask a question. Brian, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I have done now.
Yes.
I'm involved with the Yorkshire Cricket Archives. And quite recently, we purchased a trophy that was won by Rowbottom, who was a Yorkshire captain, who played cricket at the Royal Park in the 1870 odd. And that show, would you believe that that show trophy was in Holland? We are purchasing it from Holland to come over here. So how it got over there, no idea. But obviously there was quite a lot of matches played there, and Clapham was the one that really pushed it through, I think. Is that correct?
I think he was very keen on sports, actually, not just the Nur and Spell, but I think cricket was one of his interests. So yes, I think on this land that surrounded the Royal Park itself, there were various sporting events organised, and I think, and of course it had been a cricket ground. It was the Victoria Cricket Ground. I don't know a lot about that, but that was what he took over as part of that land.
Thank you.
A lot of people are using the chat to thank you for your talk, Eve, but I can't see any questions. Just give you a couple of minutes. Does anyone want to ask a final question?
Alan, can I ask a question?
Yes,
Wendy Eccles. Eve, do you know this? We live on Springbank Crescent.
Right.
Would we be absorbed into the park there?
Springbank, I'd have to look.
Well, Springbank Crescent is next to Spring Lane, which you mentioned in your talk.
Road, yes. If you're going down towards where the park was, if you're on the left, is that Springbank? That's where the school is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It would have been near to the park. It all depends just where the boundary line is. You have to have a look at that on a map, I think. One of the old Ordnance Survey maps might help you with that.
Yeah, so I'll do that, Eve. Thank you ever so much. It's been so interesting. Great, thank you.
Yes, a lot of people. Yeah, that's right. Is there any final question?
Could I just mention something, Alan? Because there is now an audio walk round the old gardens, and people can access that either through the Headingley Leeds website or through something called 365leedsstories.org. But it's called A Garden Through Time. I mean, people might just be like to be aware of that, because it leads you round what is left of the gardens with some stories from its history. So just to let people know that does exist.